A few of you, or probably actually many of you, were here last year when we got to have Steve Hayward come and talk to us about his experiences, and it's great to get to continue that tradition this year with the newest, I always mess up the title, I get the words mixed up, visiting scholar in conservative thought and policy. Yes, all right, I didn't mess it up, all right. So it's a pretty neat tradition, and it's a very unique opportunity since we're in such close proximity to the university. Dr. Birzer normally teaches at Hillsdale. He's a fellow at a variety of economic and pro-liberty organizations, which is fantastic, and we're very happy to have him come here tonight to share his thoughts about the American founding, democracy, and some other interesting topics. So please welcome Dr. Brad Birzer.
Well, good evening, everyone. So I know you had Steve Hayward last year, and Steve's a friend of mine, and I'm glad that we're keeping this tradition going, and I'm excited to find out what's going to happen next year with the program. I know there are a lot of things going on with the administration. The president's all in favor of it. The faculty have actually been great, and so have the donors. I mean, just wonderful. So it's been really nice. But one of the reasons I have to say I am very excited to be here tonight is, and I know those who sit in my class may not quite recognize this, but I have to restrain myself so much in class. And it's not because any of my students have any particular beliefs, one way or the other, about libertarianism or conservatism. I just feel like when I'm in a classroom, I have to be as objective as possible. And I'm at February, right? We're in the 4th week, and I just needed to let loose. So I needed to be around some people who actually think guns are fun, and I had to. So this is great. So thank you for having me very much. What I wanted to do tonight, and Brian and Mike said I could basically talk about anything that I wanted, and that's a dangerous thing, especially for someone who likes to talk. Very dangerous, and I'll try and keep my time down to a minimum. I was told I could talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A. But I want to start off, if I can pull this up, I want to start off by reading some excerpts from the American founding on the meaning of democracy, and what they thought democracy was, and what their idea was about democracy, whether it was good or bad, or whether it could be a problem or not. And this is where, again, I'm with a group of friends here, so I'll let loose just a little bit. But one thing that we have to remember about the American founding period is that the founders were very much in line with property, with the exchange of property. They believed very strongly in natural rights. And they did believe that there was an element for democracy, but it was a very, very small element. And it wasn't that they didn't believe in freedom. I think their argument, which was an extremely sound argument, and one that, especially in 2015, we have to be very careful about, their argument was that politics had its place. And that place could be very solid, it could be very good, it could be very strong even, but it had to be extremely limited. And that was, we find this with both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, that they may have argued over to the extent of power, but that power was always to be restrained by constitutional means, whether that was tradition or something else. And so the idea that you could have a democracy in which you just have the majority of people voting on the most important things all the time, they saw this as incredibly intrusive and very threatening, because it means that those things which had been relegated to the sphere of politics could now expand, and there was an imperialism. And so, what do we see now? We have everywhere, almost everything can be voted on at this point. And for those of us, I'm in my late 40s, those of us who grew up in the 80s, we know that wasn't always the case. It was moving that way, but we've moved so dramatically. We take a flight, show up at Denver airport, and we know what can be done to us, what can be done to our daughters, what can be done to our children, just on the whim of an agent, someone who thinks that we are guilty, when we are, in fact, we should be presumed innocent under common law. So I want to read to you, these are from the opening, this is from the opening of the constitutional debates. And then I'm going to jump forward to a really quirky person that probably a lot of people haven't heard of, a guy named Fisher Ames. And one of his speeches he gave as a senator from Massachusetts, just briefly. But if we look on the opening days of the Constitutional Convention, here when they're trying to explain why are they meeting, what's this for, why do we need a U.S. Constitution, here we have a representative from Massachusetts. The evils we experience flow from our excess of democracy. It's not that the people want virtue, but they have become the dupes of those who pretend to be patriots. That's pretty interesting. It does sound very familiar, very familiar. And here's someone from Virginia. He observed, and this is Madison writing this, right, so in third person, he observed that the general object was to provide a cure for the evils under which the United States now labored, and that in tracing those evils to their origin, every man at the convention would recognize that they came from the turbulence and follies of democracy. So this was a pretty standard view, and we know, and this is one of those things that I think a lot of people in the modern era feel uncomfortable with. But we know that to call someone a Democrat during the founding, and no matter what our textbooks say, when they'll list Jefferson and they'll call him a Democrat or a Democratic Republican, if to call someone a Democrat, small d Democrat, during the founding, was akin to calling them an animal. It was saying that they were ruled by their passions, that they did not allow reason to flourish, and we know that it led to duels. This was... yes, that's right. I mean, it actually led to duels to say something like this. And that worry about democracy, of course, goes all the way back to Plato. It's very rooted in the Western tradition. So again, it's not freedom. It's the idea that democracy votes can encompass all kinds of things. Well, let me jump to my favorite quote. This is from Fisher Ames, who was a very strange, eccentric person. I don't think those of us who are, and I assume we all are, from a libertarian or conservative background, would necessarily think to look to Ames very much. He basically lost his career fighting for sugar subsidies. So it's probably not necessarily our hero. But I love what he says in 1806. He says, "Our disease is democracy. It is not the skin that festers, our very bones are carious, and their marrow blackens with gangrene. Which rogue shall be first is of no moment. Our republicanism is already dying, and I am sorry for it. But why should we care what sexton happens to be in office at our funeral? Nevertheless, though I indulge no hopes, I do derive much entertainment from the squabbles in Madame Liberty's family. After so many liberties have been taken with her, I presume she is no longer a miss or a virgin, but she may still be a goddess." So that's good oratory, right? And that, I think, that really does give us a suggestion of what the founders thought about this. And I also stress this as well, and we could get into a huge talk about this. And I happen to be very fortunate. I get to teach founding, the Jacksonian period, and then American Civil War. I do this every year. I've got the 3 sequence courses at Hillsdale, and I love it. But when you look to the actual founding of the Democratic Party, and I had a chance to talk a little bit about this with Brad and some of the others at the Republican convention up in Longmont, the party, the Democratic Party, did not exist until 1827. There is no Jefferson or Madisonian wing of the Democratic Party. It was founded in 1827, and it was only in that year that people were willing to take that name and actually apply it. That's 50 years after the founding that you have that first assertion of what a party is. And of course, what did they stand for? They stood for removing the Indians. They stood for protecting slaves, protecting slave owners. I mean, this was not, from the beginning, it was not the greatest of parties. And it has always been about interest, never about the common good or the public good or the republic as a whole. So we find this kind of strange thing that goes with democracy and how democracy comes about. So what's the alternative to that? What kind of vision did our founders have about how we would deal with one another, how we would really exist in community? So let me read something here. Let me, sorry, that's not too obnoxious. I just want to pull out, this is one of my favorite documents from the founding. And it's a document that my grandparents would have had to have memorized parts of it to have graduated high school. This is, hardly anyone studies this anymore. It's a founding document. It was passed unanimously by Congress on July 13th of 1787. Every single state voted for it. And this was the Northwest Ordinance. And it's very interesting. I love thinking about what was going on here. I just read May 31st, 1787, where you have the constitutional debate going on throughout the entire summer. And that all took place in Philadelphia, extremely hot, sweltering summer. But our Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, was also in session during that summer, and they were meeting in New York. And here you have 2 groups of founders. I'm not sure who you would say was more legitimate. You've got the people who were elected to Congress under the Articles, and then you have those who are at the Constitutional Convention debating this. And those people who were up in New York in Congress passed unanimously this law for the Northwest Ordinance. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's actually a fairly long law, but I want to just look at the 6 amendments that go to, or 6 articles, not amendments, the articles, the central parts of what they were trying to get at. This is Article 1. No person demeaning himself in a peaceable or orderly manner shall ever be molested on account of his mode of worship or religious sentiments. So this is pretty amazing. This is the first time we have seen a law that allows for complete religious toleration. As far as I know, this is really only probably the 3rd law passed since the fall of Rome that would allow for this kind of toleration at this level. Pretty extensive. I mean, here you have, and of course, number 1, they're assuming people are going to be people of faith, and that was pretty typical at the time. So these are people who are going to worship, but as long as they don't hurt anyone, they can do whatever they like. Article 2. The inhabitants of the said territory shall always be entitled to the benefits of the writ of habeas corpus, trial by jury, proportionate representation of the people in the legislature, and everything in the course of the common law. Now, we could spend an entire semester on this. This is amazing. Right? And of course, so many things we take for granted. The idea of being represented by our peers in a trial if we get thrown into a criminal court. The idea that we would have 12 and they have to be from the local area. They can't import people from Georgia or from California. They have to be citizens here. And it's an amazing institution. Or the idea that we are innocent until proven guilty, which of course has fallen by the wayside for quite a while now, but is firmly rooted in the Anglo law tradition. So all of the rights of the common law are established there. But then let me jump to the end of this. And this, for any of us who have any libertarian leanings at all, this should just make our souls sing in the way that they present this. So it is, and I'm quoting here, it is understood that in the just preservation of rights and property, that is declared that no law ought ever be made or have force that shall in any manner whatsoever interfere with, affect private contracts, engagements, unless fraud has been detected. Now that's astounding. There can be no political vote that overturns a private contract unless fraud has been detected. Now that's not limited to business. I think for those of us, how Brian's going off to grad school in econ, we often think, well, they're talking about business and people being able to relate one to another. That applies just as much to family, to marriage, to creating a church, to creating a school. I teach at a little college that defied the federal government several times in the 60s and 70s, and we have a kind of a truce, nothing more than that, a gentleman's agreement with the federal government that they won't impose laws on Hillsdale College as long as we don't take any federal funding at any level. And we haven't done that. We're totally free of federal control. It is amazing. But what did they use when that case was taken up to the Supreme Court? And it didn't quite make it to the Supreme Court. It was arbitrated outside of court. But when it was, the argument that Hillsdale used was, we exist in Michigan. Our initial law is essentially the Northwest Ordinance, even before the Constitution. And they bought it, amazingly enough. They bought it. And of course, Dr. Arnn, our president, loves saying, we were pro-black, we were pro-freedom long before the federal government was. You don't have any right to tell us what to do. And he's right. And he's absolutely right about that. And of course, Hillsdale has stood for that. And not just Hillsdale, but this is part of our institutions. And so I get a little frustrated when I hear libertarians extolling the virtues of the market, not because they're wrong, only because I think that has to be taken into every area of life. It's not enough that it's just in the market. It is, if my wife and I want to get married and we want to have a certain number of kids, and that is completely our choice, as long as we have entered into this freely. And that is guaranteed in this document. And certainly was a fundamental part of the American tradition all the way up until the 1940s. And think about what we're doing here. Mike and Brian organizing this. None of us has to be here. We all chose to be here. We took different routes to get here. We left at different times to get here. We chose when we got here who to interact with. We've made a number of choices just to be here. And that is all part of this tradition of associating one with another. So none of us took a vote. Right? We didn't have a vote. Notice what happened, when we started seeing a very nice speaker talking about Americans for Prosperity went on too long. What happened? We didn't vote. He was just told, sorry, you're violating our rules. So, and he agreed, right? He agreed. It was great. So this is part of associate. I hope you know I'm just teasing you wherever you are. You're back there. This is all. Yes, thank you. I'm happily have been a part of the Koch family for a long time. So I think this is something that's fundamental that we often miss. We have this ability, and it is deeply rooted in who and what we are, not just in the First Amendment, that we have the right to assemble and petition, but we have the right to associate. We can associate with whom we so choose to associate. It's a fundamental aspect of American liberties. I might go so far if pushed to say it is the central aspect of our liberties, the ability to engage with one another as long as fraud doesn't exist there. So let me finish off with a person that I find probably the most interesting, thank you very much, Dee, the most interesting critic of America. And this is Alexis de Tocqueville. And I highly recommend, you can find a number of different editions of this. This is one of those books I think you can get for $1.99 on Kindle if you want. It's also worth owning. I do think it's essential. I wish every American read this. It really is the best analysis. And one of the things, this is Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville. So de Tocqueville came over in 1830 and 1831. He was very young. He was born in 1805. So he was a young man, and he got a grant, no money, just got permission from the king, the newly appointed king in France. He got permission to come over and study America's prison systems because we had a reputation for having the most liberal prisons. And he did that. He wrote his report for the king. But his real objective was to understand what was happening in the American Republic and what this meant. And his argument with Democracy in America, and he's not happy about this, his argument is that we are moving inexorably. We don't have a choice about this. This is happening, whether it's God or nature, whatever it is. The entire world is moving towards a radical egalitarianism. And what we can choose, he says, is we can choose whether that will be an egalitarianism of mediocrity or of excellence. So he says we have a choice. Right? We look at this, we know equality is coming. So not just equality of rights, but level playing field equality. So are we going to do that? Are we going to create an equality that says we allow everyone to be equal so they can pursue their excellence? Or do we tear our neighbor down because we're jealous of their abilities? And he says America could go either way. There are aspects of America that will allow it to pursue excellence. There are other aspects that, just because of the nature of the human person, will probably tend towards the lowest common denominator. And he's fearful about this. But he says the one advantage we have over every other Western people is that we know how, thanks Nancy, that we know how to associate with one another. He says this is the fundamental fact of American culture, that we know how to form communities, and with those communities, we are able to do almost anything. And I ask us to think about that for a moment. What exactly, I'll pull it from here, I've got it here. What exactly does that community mean? What is the community in and of itself? So I'm going to quote here, so I'm sorry, I'm cheating because I have it in my book, but I didn't see it right away. So I'll take it from here, from what I had written out. De Tocqueville says, the single most interesting thing about Americans is that Americans of all ages, all stations of life, and all types of disposition are forever forming associations. These are not only commercial and industrial associations in which all take part, but there are 1,000 different types: religious, moral, serious, futile, general, limited, immense, minute. Americans combine to found seminaries, build churches, distribute books and missionaries. Hospitals, prisons, and schools take shape in this way. And finally, if the American wants to proclaim a truth or propagate some feeling by the encouragement of a great example, they form an association. In every case, as the head of a new undertaking, in France you would find the government, or in England some territorial magnate. In the United States, you were sure to find an association. And how better could we describe America? Well, I think even when we just think about the very beginnings of English settlement in North America, imagine 120 Calvinists lost not in Virginia, showing up at this place, Plymouth Rock. And when they get there, do they go into chaos and start shooting each other because there's no formal law? Of course not. They work together. And the very first thing they do is they write a single paragraph called the Mayflower Compact. Right? They called it the Plymouth Combination. The name Mayflower Compact is put on in 1793, a full century and a half after they wrote it. And what do they say? We pledge our honor to one another to live by these sets of laws, to live by the common law, and, because they're a deeply religious people, by Scripture. And here we are. Now, that is the opening document. That is the opening move to create a civil body politic. And how many of us have benefited from that? Whether it's the college we went to or a church we belong to, all of these things, our community associations, all of these come down to the fact that we have been able to choose, and of course that's being limited very quickly, but we have been able to choose with whom we associate and what that means to us. We do it all the time. We're doing it right now. We're absolutely doing it right now. And very few of us are probably worried that the ATF is going to raid us, right? That's probably not going to happen. It's possible, but probably not likely, right? And I know there's at least one guy in here who's packing heat tonight, so we might be okay. But I mean, it's just probably not going to happen. And this is fundamental to who and what we are. And what de Tocqueville says then, says the great worry is that with this idea, again, equality can be a very good thing because it can be an equality of rights, equality before the transcendent, equality of races, equality of peoples, that's all very good. But when it comes down to a jealousy and we want equality because we are angry at the excellences of our neighbor, at that point, everything goes wrong, he says. And this is what he predicts, and this is astounding, that he predicted this as early. So I mentioned he comes over in 1830 and 31. He goes back to France and he writes volume 1 of Democracy in America in 1835, and volume 2 then comes out. Nancy, can I have you hold that for a second? Volume 2 comes out in 1840. And what he says, and I love this, what he describes, thanks Nancy, what he describes is he says, America will lose its understanding of republicanism, that is of liberty, and it will adopt and he doesn't have a term for it, he says there's nothing like it that exists. It will be a soft tyranny. It will not be the kind of tyranny where you've got the thug basically crushing your skull with his boot. So that's probably not going to happen in America. But what will happen is that we will all agree not to disagree, and we will all become very soft, and this will be a kind of soft or democratic despotism. So he says, here's what I've understood. Old words such as despotism and tyranny will not fit what will happen. The thing is new, and I cannot find a word for it, but I tell you it's vital that I try to define it. And this is his conclusion to the entire book. So this is not a happy conclusion. He says, I'm trying to imagine under what novel features despotism will appear in America. In the first place, I see an innumerable multitude of men, alike, equal, constantly circling around in pursuit of the petty and the banal. Over this kind of man will stand an immense protective power, which is alone responsible for securing their enjoyment and watching over their fate. That power will be absolute, thoughtful of every detail, orderly, provident, and probably gentle. And now he means gentle compared to what we see under Frederick the Great and others, right? He's not envisioning it'll be kind, but that it'll be much softer. He says it will resemble a parental authority. If father-like, it tries to prepare its charges for a man's life, but on the contrary, it will try and keep all of its citizens in perpetual childhood. It will see the citizens enjoy themselves, provided that they think of nothing but enjoyment, and it will gladly work for their happiness, because it wants to be the sole agent and judge of what happiness is. It will provide for their security, and it will foresee and supply their necessities. It will facilitate their pleasures, manage their principal concerns, direct their industry, and it will rule everything with their testaments as it divides their inheritances. Why should it not entirely relieve them from the trouble of thinking, caring, or living? It will not break the will of man. It will soften, bend, and guide. It will not enjoin, but it will inhibit. It will not destroy his free will. It will never allow him to think there is free will or allow free will to be born. Now that's de Tocqueville in 1840. And I think when we look at the welfare state, when we look at the kinds of expectations that have come down, we see that much of what de Tocqueville said is deeply prophetic. And so I don't want to end this on a negative note. I want us to be positive about this. And I guess growing up in the 80s, I'm still fairly positive about a lot of things. I think there's still a lot of good things that can be done. In fact, we're meeting right here. It's a small thing, but it's also a huge thing. We don't know what kind of ideas that may be exchanged here or in 2 weeks or 2 weeks after that, where these things can lead. And one of the things that I think, and of course I'm speaking as a 47-year-old professor, but one of the things that I've noticed in my own life, especially with academia moves really, really slowly. And a lot of things move really slowly. And I do thank God, and I mean that quite literally. I thank God that technology and innovation moves very rapidly. And as long as it does, now, as Milton Friedman said, it can outcompete government. But there will be a breaking point. There will be a point where it is no longer able to compete, or as de Tocqueville says, the possibility of even starting to think we have free will be so limited that it won't even enter into our minds. One of the notes that he makes, I think is, again, just an astounding thought. He says the greatest problem with the habit of not practicing our freedom is we eventually lose the idea that we ever had it in the first place. This is what he says, and his argument is that it becomes so much a part of who we are not to choose that it is essentially not even possible to look at objectively anymore. It's just become what we do. And that's what we have to avoid. And I love the fact that when we come out here to Colorado and we get to spend this glorious year here, I meet really interesting individuals. I meet people who like to be eccentric. I meet people who like to dress a little bit differently. I meet people who like to be artistic. And whatever Boulder's politics are, I can say this with certainty, and I've not had a single bad problem in Boulder. I've had a great time. But I can say this, when I walk around the streets of Boulder, there's a lot of energy. I mean, a lot of energy. I'm not saying it's always put to the best uses, but it is a lot of energy. And it's pretty wonderful, actually, to see that kind of diversity. It's not the kind of depression that I see in Jackson, Michigan, or Detroit. There's a lot of energy, and there's a lot of greatness. Part of that, I think, is because you people buy into eccentricity and individuality. I think part of it is there are very few people out here who seem to be conformists naturally. It's a very, very healthy thing. I think part of it's a part of being a Westerner, just knowing that you know who you are, and there's a confidence in that. So if I can leave you with anything tonight, I ask you, we're in a bad way, right? But I don't want to leave you with that. I want to suggest that there are possibilities to overcome this. And a lot of it just takes ingenuity, and it takes the willingness to be confident in the idea you have and to push forward with that and to be willing to challenge those who don't see that, those who want to limit us, even if they do so in complete ignorance, which I think is often the case, especially with the left. So, thank you. So, Brian, I think